Robert Anderson was the kind of man who commanded every room he entered, not merely because of his immense wealth, though he possessed plenty of it, but because of a certain unyielding gravity. He carried himself with the absolute unshakable confidence of a man who had never tasted the bitter flavor of failure or felt the ground beneath him tremble. At the age of 34, he had already carved out a massive empire in the heart of the American Northeast, specifically within the glass and steel canyons of New York City. His name Anderson was synonymous with the skyline itself, as his 3 construction firms were responsible for the most prestigious residential towers in Manhattan and luxury estates in Greenwich, Connecticut. Robert lived by a clockwork precision that left no room for the messy, unpredictable variables of human emotion, waking every morning at 5 o'clock to train his body before arriving at his mahogany-clad office by 7 o'clock sharp. His life was a high-stakes chess match played with multi-million-dollar contracts, expensive suits, and dinners at restaurants where the wine lists were longer than most novels. He resided in a sprawling neoclassical estate in Greenwich, a house that boasted more rooms than he could ever possibly occupy, and a garden so vast it required a small army of staff to maintain. For Robert, the house was less a home and more a trophy, a physical manifestation of his dominance over his rivals and his mastery of the market. He had a cook who came 3 times a week, a landscape architect for the grounds, and a housekeeper who kept the interior polished to a surgical shine. That housekeeper was Linda Miller, a woman who had worked for him for 3 years, quietly moving through the background of his life, like a ghost in the machinery. Linda was diligent, attentive, and treated the grand house with a level of care that Robert himself never bothered to display. Yet he barely registered her presence beyond a curt nod. To him, she was a functional necessity, an employee whose wages were paid on time in exchange for a life that ran without friction, and he never once paused to ask her about her world. His social life was equally curated, centered around Heather Vance, a beautiful and brilliant cardiologist from a prominent family who had been his partner for 2 years. On paper, they were the ultimate New York power couple, the kind of pairing that Robert's parents, Charles and Barbara, spoke of with glowing pride during their country club brunches. Charles Anderson often reminded his son that a man of his stature needed a woman like Heather, someone whose pedigree matched the Anderson name and whose ambition mirrored his own. Barbara was already envisioning the society wedding of the decade, complete with a guest list of senators and industrial titans, but Robert felt a gnawing, nameless void whenever he was with Heather. There was no fire in their conversations, no soul in their shared silences, only a polished surface that reflected back what the world expected to see. 6 months prior, Robert had ended the relationship with a clinical, polite firmness that left Heather stunned and vengeful, warning him that he would never find another woman of her caliber. Unfazed by her tears or her warnings, Robert had retreated further into the fortress of his work, believing that his professional success was a sufficient shield against any form of loneliness. He was a man who believed he was the architect of his own destiny, entirely unaware that the foundations of his world were already beginning to crack in the most subtle of ways. It started as a faint irritation in his eyes at the end of a 14-hour workday, a slight redness that he dismissed as the inevitable price of staring at blue light screens and blueprints. He ignored the itching and the dryness, assuming that a few extra hours of sleep or a weekend away would resolve the issue, but the redness persisted into the early mornings. It was a minor inconvenience, a small blemish on his otherwise perfect health, and he treated it with the same dismissiveness he showed to anyone who wasn't a business associate. He had no way of knowing that this small physical annoyance was the first tremor of an impending earthquake that would level everything he had built. During a Sunday dinner at his parents' estate, Barbara noticed the irritation and fretted with the characteristic anxiety of a mother who saw her son as a delicate investment. Charles merely grunted, suggesting that Robert was working too hard. But it was Robert's younger brother, Andrew, who leaned in with a look of intense fraternal concern. Andrew worked as a manager in one of the construction firms, a position Robert had given him out of a sense of family obligation, rather than a belief in Andrew's competence. Andrew mentioned that he had a friend who was a top-tier ophthalmologist, who had provided him with a specialized imported eye drop for chronic strain and irritation. He spoke with such earnestness, such a desire to be helpful to the older brother. He had always lived in the shadow of that. Robert felt a rare pang of brotherly warmth. Andrew promised to bring the bottle by the office the following Tuesday, assuring Robert that it was a miracle cure for anyone spending their life looking at architectural renderings. When Andrew arrived with the small, unlabeled glass vial, Robert thanked him and placed it in his desk drawer, touched by the gesture from the brother he often overlooked. Andrew instructed him to use the drops 3 times a day, once in the morning, once at noon, and once before bed, claiming they were custom formulated for maximum relief. Robert followed the instructions to the letter, trusting his brother implicitly, because in his world, family was the one thing that was supposed to be beyond the reach of corporate sabotage. For the first few days, the redness seemed to subside, providing a false sense of security that allowed Robert to dive even deeper into a massive new development project. But then, the world began to lose its sharp edges, the crisp lines of his blueprints becoming blurred and indistinct, as if a thin layer of gauze had been draped over his pupils. He assumed he simply needed glasses, a common enough occurrence for a man in his 30s, but the fog didn't lift with rest or hydration. Instead, it grew thicker. Within a week, the blurriness had transformed into a persistent haze, making it nearly impossible for him to read the fine print of the contracts that were the lifeblood of his empire. He found himself increasing the font size on his computer screen, then moving closer to the monitor, his heart beginning to beat, with a rhythmic pulsing dread he had never known. The meetings became an exercise in terror as he struggled to recognize the faces of his board members from across the conference table, their features dissolving into featureless masks. He consulted a series of high-priced specialists in Manhattan, undergoing a battery of tests that left the doctors scratching their heads in genuine professional confusion. Structurally, his eyes appeared healthy, leading one physician to suggest that the issue was neurological, or perhaps a manifestation of extreme chronic stress. Robert left those offices feeling more vulnerable than a child clutching the vial of drops Andrew had given him, never once suspecting the liquid inside. 3 months after the first drop hit his eye, Robert woke up in his Greenwich bedroom and found himself submerged in a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He blinked rapidly, rubbed his eyes until they ached and fumbled for the lamp on his bedside table, clicking the switch repeatedly in a desperate search for even a sliver of light. There was nothing, not a shadow, not a glimmer, only a void that seemed to swallow his very identity, leaving him gasping for air in the center of his own expensive bed. He cried out, his voice cracking with a raw, primal fear that he hadn't felt since he was a boy, lost in the woods. And it was Linda Miller who reached him first. She had just begun her shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, and hearing the panicked shouts from the master suite, she rushed upstairs without a second thought. She found the most powerful man in the city, huddled in the dark, his hands trembling as he reached out for a world that had vanished overnight. The weeks that followed were a descent into a private hell that Robert Anderson could never have imagined, even in his darkest nightmares, a period defined by the sterile smell of hospitals. He was subjected to every imaging technology known to modern medicine, from magnetic resonance imaging to computerized tomography scans, as the best minds in the country tried to solve the riddle. Their final diagnosis was a devastating blow that felt like a death sentence: permanent blindness caused by an irreversible degradation of the optic nerve, possibly due to an unidentified toxin. Robert sat in his hospital bed, surrounded by the luxury he could no longer see, and felt the floor of his life disintegrate, leaving him suspended in a permanent midnight. He was discharged into the care of a world that suddenly felt too large, too loud, and entirely indifferent to the fact that its king had been blinded. Linda was the one who drove him home to Greenwich because Andrew had claimed to be overwhelmed with the sudden burden of managing the construction firms in Robert's absence. Upon returning to the mansion, Robert retreated into the master suite and refused to cross the threshold for 7 days, sinking into a depression that was as black as his vision. He refused to eat, he refused to bathe, and he certainly refused to speak to the few friends who called with voices thick with the kind of pity he found loathsome. Linda would knock gently on his door every morning at 8 o'clock, announcing that breakfast was ready, only to be met with a muffled command for her to leave him alone. She would leave the tray on a small table outside his door, and when she returned hours later, the food was usually cold and untouched, a silent testament to his despair. His parents called frequently at first, their voices trembling with shock, but they seemed paralyzed by the tragedy, unable to offer anything beyond hollow platitudes and awkward silences. Robert could hear the discomfort in his father's voice, the sound of a man who didn't know how to deal with a son who was no longer a reflection of his own success. The rage arrived after the first week, a volcanic explosion of frustration that Robert directed at the only person who refused to abandon him, Linda Miller. When he finally emerged from his room disheveled and smelling of stagnant grief, he lashed out at the sounds of her cleaning the rhythmic swish of her broom, feeling like an insult. He accused her of pitying him, of staying only for the generous salary he had once paid her, and he demanded that she quit and find work elsewhere like the others. The cook and the gardener had already resigned, unable to deal with Robert's unpredictable temper and the oppressive atmosphere of a house that felt like a mausoleum. Linda, however, did not flinch, nor did she raise her voice in return. She simply continued her work with a quiet, steely resolve that Robert found infuriating. She told him that she would leave when she was finished with her duties, and not a moment before, regardless of how many expensive vases he managed to break. Andrew's visits were frequent, but they were coated in a layer of artificial concern that felt like cheap plastic to Robert's heightened sense of hearing and intuition. Andrew would sit in the leather armchair in the library, sighing deeply as he recounted the stresses of the office and the difficult decisions he was forced to make. He would tell Robert to rest, to focus on his adjustment, while subtly hinting that the business was moving on, and that Robert's presence was no longer required for its survival. Every word Andrew spoke was a calculated needle, designed to remind Robert of his newfound uselessness and to ensure he remained isolated within the walls of the Greenwich estate. Robert didn't realize that Andrew was simultaneously poisoning the well with their parents, telling Charles and Barbara that Robert was too ashamed to see them and wanted total solitude. He painted a picture of a brother who had given up on life, making it easier for their parents to stay away and avoid the pain of seeing their golden son fallen. By the second month of his blindness, the mansion was nearly empty of staff, leaving only Linda to manage the vast property and the increasingly difficult man who owned it. Robert spent his days sitting by the large bay window in the library, listening to the wind in the trees and the distant sound of the Atlantic Ocean, feeling like a ghost. He would occasionally try to navigate the hallways, but he would inevitably stumble, bruising his shins on furniture he had once chosen for its aesthetic value and now cursed for its existence. Linda began to implement a subtle, brilliant system of organization, placing tactile markers on the walls, and ensuring that every object in the house remained in a fixed, predictable position. She didn't ask for his permission. She simply did it, creating a map of the world that Robert could feel with his hands, since he could no longer see it with his eyes. When he screamed at her for moving his things, she would calmly explain that she hadn't moved them, he had simply forgotten where they were, forcing him to confront his own disorientation. It was during a particularly violent thunderstorm that the dynamic between them finally shifted, a moment of raw honesty that broke through the crust of Robert's bitterness. He had tried to walk to the kitchen for a glass of water, but he had miscounted his steps and collided with the edge of the heavy dining table, falling to the floor. The pain in his knee was sharp, but the pain in his pride was agonizing. And he began to strike the floor with his fists, cursing the darkness and the God he didn't believe in. Linda appeared at his side, her voice calm and steady as she reached out to help him up. But he pushed her away with a snarl of, "I don't need your help." She didn't retreat this time. Instead, she sat down on the floor right next to him, her presence a quiet anchor in the middle of his emotional storm. She told him that he was allowed to be angry, but he wasn't allowed to be a coward, and that his blindness didn't give him the right to be a monster. Robert froze, the sheer audacity of her words cutting through his rage like a blade, as no one had ever dared to speak to him with such blunt, unvarnished truth. He asked her why she was still there, why she hadn't fled like the others to a house where the master wasn't a blind man prone to fits of violence. Linda replied that she stayed because she saw the man beneath the architect, a man who was terrified and lonely, and she knew what it felt like to be both of those things. She told him about her own life, about losing her mother to cancer when she was only 16, and having to build a life from the wreckage of her grief. She spoke of the years she spent working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head, and how she had learned that strength isn't about never falling, but about how you get up. Robert listened in total silence, the sound of the rain against the glass, the only accompaniment to a story of resilience that made his own struggles feel like the complaints of a child. For the first time in his 34 years, Robert Anderson really listened to another human being, not for information or leverage, but for the sake of connection. He realized that Linda Miller, the woman he had treated like a piece of furniture for 3 years, possessed a depth of character that eclipsed everyone he had ever known in Manhattan. She wasn't impressed by his bank account or his former status. She saw him as a person flawed and broken, and she chose to stay anyway. That night the darkness felt a little less like a prison, and more like a space where a new kind of light could eventually grow if he was willing to let it. He allowed her to help him up and guide him back to his room, and for the first time since the lights went out, he said a quiet, genuine, "Thank you." Linda simply patted his hand and told him to get some rest, her voice carrying a warmth that was more comforting than any expensive scotch or silk sheet. In the months that followed that stormy night, the relationship between the fallen titan and the quiet housekeeper evolved into something that defied the traditional boundaries of their roles. Robert began to rely on Linda not just for navigation and sustenance, but for a window into the world he had lost, asking her to describe the visual details he once took for granted. She became his eyes, painting vivid pictures, with her words describing the way the morning light hit the Connecticut hills, or the specific shade of gold the leaves turned in October. They established a routine that brought a sense of order to his chaotic internal world. Beginning with Linda reading the financial news and architectural journals over breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning. He found that his mind was still sharp, his instincts for the market still humming beneath the surface, and Linda's voice became the bridge that reconnected him to his professional identity. She didn't just read the facts, she asked questions challenging his assumptions, and forcing him to explain the complexities of urban development in a way that sharpened his own understanding. Robert discovered that he had a profound capacity for memory, that he had never tapped into memorizing the layout of the mansion down to the last square inch under Linda's patient tutelage. She taught him to use his other senses to perceive the environment, pointing out the subtle changes in the air currents near an open door or the specific creak of a floorboard. He learned to identify the birds in the garden by their songs and the time of day by the warmth of the sun on his skin, finding a strange, quiet beauty in a world of textures and sounds. His parents still called, but their conversations were brief and strained, filled with the kind of forced cheerfulness that people use when they are talking to the terminally ill. Robert stopped expecting them to visit, realizing that they were mourning the son he used to be, rather than supporting the man he was becoming. Linda, conversely, never mourned the old Robert. She seemed to prefer the new one, the one who was humbler, more observant, and infinitely more human. Andrew continued his charade of the devoted brother, visiting the Greenwich estate once a week to deliver reports on the construction firm that were increasingly vague and dismissive. He spoke of market downturns and unforeseen complications, subtly preparing Robert for the idea that the empire was shrinking and that his return to power was a mathematical impossibility. Robert, fueled by his discussions with Linda and a newfound clarity of thought, began to notice inconsistencies in Andrew's reports, small details that didn't align with the broader economic trends. He mentioned his concerns to Linda, who had become his most trusted confidant, and she encouraged him to trust his gut, reminding him that he hadn't built a billion-dollar company by being a fool. Linda had her own suspicions about Andrew, an intuition honed by years of watching people from the sidelines, and she found his overly solicitous tone to be deeply unsettling. She noticed the way Andrew's eyes darted around the room when he spoke to Robert, and the way he seemed to physically recoil whenever Robert showed a sign of returning strength. One afternoon, while cleaning the master bathroom, Linda discovered the unlabeled vial of eye drops that Robert had been using religiously for months, the one Andrew had provided as a miracle cure. She had been reading extensively about ocular health and chemical toxins, trying to find any possible lead that the Manhattan specialists might have missed in their sterile laboratories. The lack of a label struck her as profoundly suspicious, as no legitimate pharmacy, even a custom compounding one, would dispense a medication without clear identifying information. She didn't mention it to Robert, immediately fearing she might be paranoid, but she decided to take the vial to a friend of hers, Janet, who worked as a senior research chemist at a pharmaceutical lab in New Jersey. She told Robert she had dropped the bottle and it had shattered, watching his reaction carefully, and was struck by how quickly Andrew provided a replacement bottle the very next day. This confirmed her suspicion. Andrew wasn't just managing the business. He was managing Robert's health, and he was doing it with a level of control that was terrifying. While waiting for Janet's analysis, Linda began to subtly investigate Andrew's activities at the firm. Using the office login credentials Robert had memorized and dictated to her during their late-night work sessions, they discovered that Andrew was systematically diverting funds into offshore accounts and selling off key assets of Anderson Construction at a fraction of their value to shell companies he secretly controlled. It was a classic corporate raid executed with the cold-blooded efficiency of a man who had waited his entire life to step out of his brother's long, intimidating shadow. Robert sat in the library, his face pale as Linda read the digital trail of his brother's betrayal, the magnitude of the theft eclipsed only by the magnitude of the personal treachery. He realized then that Andrew didn't just want the money. He wanted Robert broken. He wanted him dependent, and he wanted him permanently removed from the chessboard of New York real estate. The blindness wasn't an unfortunate side effect of stress. It was the primary weapon in Andrew's arsenal, a way to ensure Robert could never witness the theft of his life's work. Janet called Linda 4 days later, her voice trembling with a mixture of professional shock and personal outrage as she detailed the results of the chemical analysis. The liquid in the vial wasn't a lubricant or a medicine. It was a concentrated solution containing a rare industrial-grade toxin that caused progressive, irreversible atrophy of the optic nerve with prolonged exposure. It was a substance that left almost no trace in the bloodstream, after a few hours explaining why the initial medical tests had come up empty, while Robert's vision continued to dissolve. Janet warned Linda that the person who had provided this substance was committing a slow, calculated form of assault that was intended to result in permanent disability. Linda felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized the depth of the evil they were dealing with, a darkness far more profound than the one Robert lived in. She knew she had to tell him, but she also knew that Robert needed more than just the truth. He needed a way to reclaim his power. That evening, as a thick fog rolled in from the Long Island Sound, Linda sat Robert down and laid out the evidence with the clinical precision of a prosecutor. She told him about the toxin, about Andrew's secret accounts, and about the fact that his own brother had been poisoning him every single day for the past 6 months. Robert didn't move, didn't speak for a long time, his breathing the only sound in the vast silent room as he processed the fact that his flesh and blood was his executioner. The silence stretched for 10 minutes, a heavy, suffocating eternity, before Robert finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous growl that Linda had never heard before. He didn't ask why, because he already knew the answer. The same envy that had fueled Andrew's quiet resentment for 30 years had finally boiled over into a murderous ambition. Robert realized that he had been blind long before his eyes failed him, blind to the people around him, and blind to the true nature of the brother he thought he was protecting. With Linda's help, Robert began to orchestrate a counterattack, a strategic maneuver that would require every ounce of the cunning he had used to build his empire in the first place. He continued to play the role of the helpless, dependent victim whenever Andrew visited, even going so far as to ask for more of the miracle eye drops to keep the charade alive. Behind the scenes, Linda contacted a high-powered attorney and a private investigator, providing them with the digital evidence they had gathered and the chemical report from Janet's lab. They worked in the shadows of the mansion late into the night, building a case that would not only restore Robert's fortune, but would ensure that Andrew faced the full weight of the law. Robert found a new kind of strength in this mission, a purpose that pulled him out of his depression and gave him a reason to fight for a future he couldn't yet see. He was no longer just a man in the dark. He was a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and Linda was the partner he never knew he needed. The confrontation with Andrew was planned for a Tuesday afternoon, a day when the younger brother usually arrived with his false reports and his poisoned gifts, feeling entirely secure in his dominance. Robert sat in his usual chair in the library, the recording device Linda had hidden in the lamp already active, as Andrew walked in with the casual arrogance of a king visiting a subject. Andrew began his usual monologue about the difficulties of the firm, but Robert interrupted him, asking point-blank about a specific transaction involving a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Andrew's voice faltered for a fraction of a second before he laughed it off, accusing Robert of being confused and suggesting that his condition was finally beginning to affect his mental clarity. It was then that Linda stepped into the room holding the chemical report from Janet's lab and a folder full of bank statements that detailed Andrew's systematic looting of the Anderson fortune. She looked Andrew in the eye with a gaze that was cold and unwavering, telling him that his game was over and that the police were already on their way to the Greenwich estate. Andrew's transformation was instantaneous, the mask of the devoted brother slipping away to reveal a face contorted with a lifetime of festering, unadulterated hatred and long-held bitterness. He didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed a jagged, ugly sound that echoed through the library as he boasted about how easy it had been to dismantle Robert's life. He told Robert that he deserved to be in the dark, that he had always been too arrogant, too perfect, and that it was finally Andrew's turn to be the sun around which the family orbited. He confessed to the poisoning with a chilling pride, describing how he had researched the toxin to ensure it would be effective without being immediately detectable by the pampered doctors Robert favored. He was so caught up in his own villainous monologue that he didn't realize Linda was recording every single word, a full confession captured for the authorities who were currently pulling into the long driveway. When the handcuffs finally clicked around Andrew's wrists, Robert felt a strange lack of triumph, only a deep, hollow sadness for the brother he had lost long before the poison started. The aftermath of Andrew's arrest was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, corporate restructuring, and a profound, agonizing reckoning for Robert's parents, Charles and Barbara. When they were presented with the evidence of Andrew's crimes, they were shattered, forced to confront not only the evil of one son, but their own failure to protect the other. They came to the Greenwich estate, their voices broken with shame, as they apologized to Robert for their distance and for believing Andrew's lies about his desire for isolation. Robert received them with a quiet, dignified grace, but he made it clear that the bridge they had burned would take a long time to rebuild, and that his trust was not easily won back. He noticed that they still looked at him with a degree of pity, and he found that he no longer cared for their approval or their pedigree, as his values had shifted irrevocably. His true family, he realized, was the woman who had stood in the room when everyone else had fled, the woman who had fought for his life when he had given up on it. With Andrew in custody and the business back under his legal control, Robert began the slow process of untangling the mess his brother had made, working from his home office with Linda at his side. He discovered that he could manage the firm perfectly well without his sight relying on his formidable intellect and the team of loyal executives who had been waiting for his return. He implemented new technologies, including voice-to-text software and specialized architectural tools, but his most valuable asset remained Linda, who had transitioned from housekeeper to his primary advisor and partner. Their bond, forged in the crucible of betrayal and darkness, had grown into something profound and undeniable, a love that was rooted in mutual respect and shared survival. They spent their evenings in the garden, the same place where Robert had once felt like a prisoner, now feeling like a man who had finally discovered what it meant to be free. In a surprising turn of medical events, the cessation of the toxin began to show a slow, miraculous effect on Robert's ocular health, a possibility the doctors had once dismissed as a fantasy. 6 months after the last drop of Andrew's poison had touched his eyes, Robert began to perceive flashes of light and shadows, a sign that the optic nerve was not entirely dead. It was an agonizingly slow process, requiring dozens of surgeries and months of specialized physical therapy. But Robert approached it with the same legendary determination he had once used to build skyscrapers. Linda was with him for every appointment, every painful procedure, and every moment of frustration when the progress seemed to stall or reverse. She never promised him that his sight would return completely, but she promised him that he would never be in the dark again, a vow that meant more to him than any medical miracle. Heather Vance, the cardiologist who had abandoned him when the lights went out, made a sudden and unwelcome reappearance once the news of Robert's recovery and his regained fortune hit the New York tabloids. She arrived at the Greenwich estate unannounced, dressed in a designer suit and carrying a carefully rehearsed apology for her momentary lapse in judgment and her fear of the unknown. She spoke of their shared history and their perfect compatibility, acting as if the past year of silence and abandonment had never occurred and suggesting they pick up where they left on. Robert, who could now see well enough to distinguish the cold, calculating look in her eyes, felt a wave of profound disgust for the woman he had once thought was his equal. He looked at Heather. Then he looked at Linda, who was standing quietly in the doorway, and he realized the difference between a partner for the spotlight and a partner for the soul. He told Heather with a calmness that was more devastating than any shout that she had been right when she said he would never find another woman like her, and that he was eternally grateful for that fact. He informed her that his life was full, that his heart was occupied, and that she was no longer welcome on his property or in his world, watching her walk away with a sense of final liberating closure. When he turned back to Linda, he saw the concern in her eyes, the fear that he might be tempted by the polished world he had once belonged to. He walked over to her, took her hands in his, and told her that he had never seen anything more beautiful than her face, even when he was looking at it in the dark. He realized then that his blindness had been a gift of sorts, a way to strip away the superficial and the false, leaving only the truth of who he was and who he loved. Robert's sight never fully returned, leaving the world in a gentle blur he came to appreciate, as it helped him focus on essence rather than imperfection. He returned to lead Anderson Construction with a renewed sense of ethics, dedicating his wealth to community development and affordable housing. Linda rose from housekeeper to vice president of the Anderson Foundation, and together they became a powerful team known not only for success but for integrity and compassion in an industry often lacking both. Their wedding, held in the garden where they had faced their darkest moments, was intimate and deeply meaningful. A year later, their daughter, Holly Claire, filled their home with joy, and Robert discovered a richer life than he had ever known before, one rooted in love, peace, and family. In time, their son David was born, and their home transformed into a place of warmth and belonging. Robert healed old wounds with his parents and found forgiveness within himself, choosing not to let bitterness define his future. Standing one day overlooking the city, he helped build. Robert realized his journey was not about regaining sight, but about truly learning to see. With Linda beside him, he embraced a life defined by love and purpose. Reflecting later in life, he understood that success and wealth are illusions if they come at the cost of human connection, and that true vision often emerges only after loss and hardship. He came to believe that life's deepest meaning lies in kindness, loyalty, and the quiet moments we share with others. The people who remain during our darkest times are the ones who truly matter, and the love we give is the only legacy that endures. In the end, even if everything else is taken away, the light within us, shaped by compassion and resilience, will always be enough to guide us forward.